So now we're in a position to look more closely at frame semantics, how we characterize what frame semantics is and what one does working in that theoretical framework. So first of all, frame semantics is an approach to the description and analysis of meaning that emphasizes the continuities between language and experience. Frame semantics focuses on the ways that language users understand what their language communicates. Remember, we talked about the difference between truth semantics on the one hand and a semantics of understanding on the other hand. Frame semantics takes the perspective, what do I, the speaker of a particular language, need to know not only about the grammar of the language, but about the words in the language and the way words are put together and the meanings that result from the combination of the grammar and the meanings in the language. What do I need to know about all of those things to understand the language? As a consequence, frame semantics is, of course, empirical, cognitive, and involves ethnographic research. If I'm interested in the perspective of the user's experience, then by definition, my work is ethnographic. It's not just about the forms in the language, it's about the way the people who use those forms engage with those forms, what they do with them, what they do with them, when and how, in what situations. That's ethnography. So the basic concepts of frame semantics are, of course, the frame and the frame element. One of the ways that we talk about a semantic frame is an experience-based schematization of the speaker's world that allows inferences about participants and objects in and across situations and events. This is a definition of frame that I've come to use in no small way because of my work on FrameNet. And we're going to see how this manifests in an example frame very shortly. A frame element is that which identifies the participants and props in the frame. Obviously, I'm going to have a lot more to say about frame elements and how we figure out what the frame elements of a frame are and how we name them and how they are realized linguistically, at least in English. But for now, let's begin with an example, the commercial transaction frame, which was one of the earliest examples that Fillmore used to illustrate the notion of a frame. So, here's a pictorial representation of commercial transaction. And you see that we have two individuals, and I've represented one of those individuals as having money, and another one, and the other one of those individuals having some property, in particular here, a car. So if I want to characterize the commercial transaction informally, not yet in terms of frames and frame elements, but just using informal English language prose. I can say that in a commercial transaction, what happens is one person owns something that another person wants to own. That's how we start. The second person gives money to the first person. The first person gives the second person the thing that he or she wants. And now the second person owns the thing previously owned by the first person. So if we think about the question, what are the participants and props in the commercial transaction frame, we necessarily have to list a buyer, a seller, some money, and some goods, right? Notice how the way I've identified the participants and props are different from the way Fillmore identified the case roles in the case for case, right? I'm not using agent, patient, instrument, right? I'm using much more specific labels. Here are some examples of the way English instantiates those words that we use to talk about a commercial transaction. Chuck bought a car from Jerry for $5,000. Buy, the verb buy, is one of the words that takes the commercial transaction and gives us a way to talk about what's going on during the commercial transaction. Another example, Jerry sold Chuck a car for $5,000. So we have buy, we have sell. I can also say Chuck paid $5,000 for Jerry's car. Buy, sell, pay. Jerry's car cost Chuck $5,000. So we have 4 verbs here. In frame semantics, we look at all kinds of parts of speech. Initially, however, I'm looking at verbs because it's a little easier to understand the concepts using predicates and their arguments. So that's how we're starting. So we're getting a little closer to defining the commercial transaction frame. We know its participants, the buyer and the seller, in our examples, filled by the linguistic items Chuck and Jerry, respectively. And the props involved are the money and the goods, filled by $5,000 and car. At this point during the commercial transaction, a transfer takes place, right? Chuck gives the money to Jerry, and Jerry gives the car to Chuck. Let's look at those very same sentences again, this time with more information that we've now articulated about the participants and the props and what syntactic positions they have in the example sentences. We're just looking at those nouns right now. So we see that Chuck is the buyer and Jerry is the seller and car is the goods and $5,000 fills the role money. Notice that in Jerry sold Chuck a car for $5,000, Jerry, the noun Jerry is now in subject position. And the noun Chuck is now in object position, right? In the first sentence, Chuck bought a car from Jerry for $5,000. We had the noun phrase, a car, in object position. Okay, in the next sentence, Chuck paid $5,000 for Jerry's car. So the noun Chuck is back in subject position. And now we have the noun phrase $5,000 in object position. We have Jerry, the seller of the car, as the object of the preposition for. Notice that in the first sentence, Jerry was the object of the preposition from. And we had $5,000 as the object of the preposition for. This matters especially because of the way that FrameNet annotates semantic roles or frame elements on example sentences. And we'll get to that a little later on. And of course, more and more of that as the week progresses. So in the last sentence, Jerry's car cost Chuck $5,000. Jerry is in, or I should say, Jerry's car is in subject position, and Chuck is the object of the verb cost, and $5,000 is what we might call the second object of the verb cost. So these sentences give you a good idea of what we mean by valences, right? Here are some examples of the way that these verbs manifest these semantic roles in their syntactic positions. Okay. As I said before, first we just looked at literally the noun fillers, and as I suggested, it's more than just the nouns themselves. It's the constituent in which the noun occurs that is of interest. So when we annotate examples of particular lexical units in frame semantic annotation in FrameNet, we annotate the entire constituent. So notice that in this slide, I've highlighted the entire constituent in which the noun, the relevant noun occurs with the appropriate color, not just the noun itself, right? So if we look at the first sentence, Chuck bought a car from Jerry for $5,000. From Jerry instantiates the seller, right? The entity is Jerry. The instantiation of the role comes in the constituent from Jerry. Likewise, $5,000 is the entity that fills the role, and for $5,000 is the constituent that manifests that semantic role. And likewise for the rest of the sentences. Jerry sold Chuck a car for $5,000. Chuck paid $5,000 for Jerry's car, and Jerry's car cost Chuck $5,000. These last two examples are a little more complicated, and we'll get to that later on. We see, of course, that Jerry's car, the constituent Jerry's car is actually a possessive. So the grammar of that phrase is a little more complicated than just as I've indicated here, but for now, this is meant to illustrate how the concepts I've been talking about manifest linguistically. Now we're at the end of the commercial transaction. The commercial transaction has been completed, and we see that Chuck has the car and Jerry has the money. So the transfer is complete, and we see that there's been a change from Jerry owning the car to Chuck owning the car, from Chuck having the money to Jerry having the money. Okay? Any questions? Okay. So now I'm going to introduce another concept that figures into frame semantics, and that is perspective. The idea is that different words assume different perspectives on or schematizations or framings of the same scene. If we can think about the commercial transaction, we know that each of the sentences that I've shown you takes a different perspective. So the sentence, Chuck bought a car from Jerry for $5,000, takes the perspective of the buyer. Jerry sold Chuck a car for $5,000, takes the perspective of the seller. Chuck paid $5,000 for Jerry's car, takes the perspective of the money. And Jerry's car cost Chuck $5,000, takes the perspective of the goods, right? When we actually look at the complex structure that constitutes the commercial transaction family of frames, if you will, in FrameNet, we'll see that the initial characterization of the commercial transaction frame was actually just an initial characterization. It's far more complex than suggested in this simple example. And from the initial introduction of the commercial transaction frame as a parade example for frames until some, 25 years later, we've made progress and we've characterized this complex family of frames much more in much greater detail, with more of the frame semantic concepts fleshed out and actually instantiated in the set of frames that we'll eventually look at in the FrameNet database. Now we can go back to scripts, which I mentioned earlier this morning. Schenck and Abelson talked about scripts as knowledge structures for sequences of events which can be described in terms of events, participants, sequential ordering of sub-events that are part of the larger event, and relationships among the participants in the larger event. And altogether, I think it's clear that our notion of frame and their notion of script are very similar. These two ideas are very similar. I want to spend a few minutes talking about the restaurant script. And as I talk about the restaurant script, I'm going to ask you to be thinking about other events that can be characterized in this way, that is, in terms of a script. And we're going to talk about that later. So, if you think about what happens when you go to a restaurant, you know that first you enter the restaurant. At some point, either you sit at a table or someone seats you at a table. You read the menu, you decide what you're going to eat or what you'd like to eat, and then you order. And the participants involved in this situation are, at a minimum, a diner, that is you and your friends who have gone to the restaurant, a waiter. At a minimum, there has to be someone to take your order and then deliver the food. Maybe a host or a hostess, someone who perhaps seats you at the table, or at least tells you how long you're going to have to wait until you will get a seat at the table. And then, because there's food involved, there are people preparing the food, a chef, a cook, and so on. The things that I've described happen in a particular order. It's not that it's impossible, but typically you read the menu before you order. Now, maybe you go to a restaurant that you like very much, very frequently, so you already know what you're going to order and you don't have to read a menu. But typically what happens is you look at the menu, you see what you like, and then you order. That's what we mean when we say a sequential ordering of sub-events within the larger event. Lastly, the participants in the event are in a certain relationship to each other. And there are different relationships, right? So the host or hostess has a certain relationship to you. That host or hostess also has a relationship to the waiter. The waiter is in a relationship to you, and so on and so forth. Different relationships mean that different people have to please you or someone else. Different people may have more or less power in the relationship, right? So, for example, in the diner-waiter relationship, there's a delicate balance of power. So the waiter obviously wants to please you, because after all, that may determine how much tip you leave. At the same time, if you as a diner become too annoying to the waiter, that waiter might not care about pleasing you. That waiter may only care about being done with you. So there's a kind of unspoken negotiation going on during the entire meal. So that serves as an example of how the relationship among and between the participants in the situation really matters. So this allows me to bring up an important distinction in research in semantics. And that is the distinction between onomasiology and semasiology. In onomasiology, you know the concept, and you're looking for the name. So the word onomasiology derives from the Greek word for name, and that's a hint about what you're doing if your work is taking the onomasiological perspective. This makes onomasiology kind of like a dictionary, right? You go to a dictionary and you want to find out about the word. The semasiological approach says, okay, I know the name of the object or event or process, and I'm looking for the sense. So the semasiological approach says, what is the sense that I'm after? This makes semasiological work much like a thesaurus. And this matters because FrameNet is actually both. It's like a dictionary in that it defines words, and more than a dictionary because it gives many examples and specific situations in which those words are used, along with the grammatical information that goes with those words. And it's also like a thesaurus because you can go to a frame and find out what are the senses. Okay? So now I'm going to talk about frames and lexical semantics. Earlier I said frames or frame semantics is put to work both in lexical semantics and in text semantics. It's easy to imagine that, well, if you only consider the very early works in frame semantics, you might think that frame semantics is only about lexical semantics. It's in fact useful for both lexical semantics and text semantics. During the break, I spoke with Victor, who told me that he came to this course because frame semantics will be useful to him in his work in critical discourse analysis, right? There's a very telling confirmation that frame semantics is not just for lexical semantics, even though early on it might have looked like that, and if you limit your research in frame semantics to FrameNet, you might end up with the conclusion that frame semantics is about lexical material only. So, as I said earlier, frames provide the structured background knowledge that allows speakers of a language to use and understand the words in their language. Let's think about the word breakfast. Tiago, how do you say breakfast in Portuguese? Okay, that's what we're talking about. So the word breakfast lexicalizes a number of different concepts. One is the time of the day, or the typical time of the day that we eat breakfast, which is the morning. And that usually happens after a night's sleep. You go to sleep, you wake up in the morning, you wash and dress, or maybe you just wash and you dress after you eat, but usually you eat breakfast after you sleep the night. And a typical breakfast, at least a sort of typical American breakfast, includes a set menu. There are variations, of course, but the sort of typical foods that you'll find on a menu for breakfast are things like eggs and cereal and toast, coffee, juice, tea, and so on. Now let's look at some examples of the word breakfast used in English. I can say, Ed ate fish and chips for breakfast. That's a little unusual because fish and chips are not typical for breakfast, right? But in that sentence, I understand that he ate fish and chips in the morning. Or maybe he ate fish and chips as his first meal of the day, regardless of when that was, right? And in example 2, Sam woke up that evening for his regular eggs and toast breakfast. So the menu is typical breakfast, but the time of day that Sam ate is not the usual time that people eat breakfast. Many restaurants in the US, especially what we call a diner, I guess comparable to a luncheonette here, sort of, have signs either in their window or written in the menu, breakfast served all day. So we know that in instances, something about the information that's lexicalized in the word breakfast is different. Yes, so her question was, can the word fast mean a long period without eating anything? Yes, the word breakfast in English is actually what we call morphologically complex. That is, it's made up of more than one morpheme. Clearly here, the word break and the word fast. In other words, I've broken my fast. I'm not sure that people who aren't linguists would think about it. Right.
That's what I was going to ask, because these 3 examples, I believe they're possible because we think breakfast is to break the long period without eating. It doesn't matter if it happens at evening, all day.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Nevertheless, I'm not sure that people who aren't linguists think about it, right? So I think it's difficult for linguists, and I'm in this group as well. It's difficult for linguists to imagine that the rest of the world doesn't look at words and phrases and expressions and sentences to analyze them, right? As linguists, what we do is analyze language, of course.
Just use it.
Right. So the rest of the world is made up of people who use the language and don't think about it. They use it. And as linguists, certainly as a frame semanticist, my job is to take the perspective of the user of the language. Obviously, what I add is the analysis, but that's the analysis of a linguist and not necessarily what the speaker of the language does. And it's complicated, of course, because I'm a speaker of the language too, right? But my job as a linguist is to remember that my perspective as a linguist, an analyst of language, is different from the perspective of the ordinary user, right? In the same way that if I were a chemist, for example, I would not look at this cup of water, look at this glass of water and say, H2O. But a chemist would, right? I drink the water. I wash my hands with the water, right? I wash my dishes, I take a shower. But I'm not thinking about the chemical makeup of a sentence. And I think for a linguist, it's more difficult precisely because we are speakers of our own language, right? Okay, so the question to ask here is, what makes it possible for each of these sentences to be grammatical, acceptable, used in the language? And the answer to that question allows me to introduce the notion of a prototype, which is another basic concept in frame semantics. So a prototype is a fairly large slice of the surrounding culture against which the meaning of a word is defined and understood, including that culture's institutions and practices. Importantly, the prototypical use of a word is the one that the word has when the conditions of the background situation match the defining prototype. So let's go back and look at the breakfast examples from the previous slide. As I said earlier, each one of these sentences has something different from the prototype. However, because we have a prototype, and whether as speakers of the language we're conscious of the prototype or not, we make use of that prototype for using and understanding each of these sentences. I happen to find a picture here of a typical, or at least what the internet told me was a typical Brazilian buffet breakfast. And that allows me to talk about this notion of a slice of the surrounding culture. So in my hotel this morning, I had breakfast, and I didn't see all of the typical menu items in an American breakfast, right? So what that tells me is, okay, I know I'm in Brazil, but importantly, I need to know that in Brazil, a typical breakfast is different from a typical breakfast in America, right? So maybe that tells me that there are going to be different ways of talking about a breakfast, a typical breakfast in Brazil, than a typical breakfast in America. And it's not necessarily only about the words each language has for eat and drink and the various items on the menu, right? So culture is a very important consideration when thinking about the words that a language provides for its users to talk about events and processes and objects and even people. Okay, so now we move on to frames and text semantics. So frames figure into text semantics not only because lexical items can be seen as very small texts. Yes, a lexical item is a very, very small text. Importantly, even a single word plays an important role in the construction of the meaning of any longer text. And I'm going to look at two sentences. Happen to be sentences that I think illustrate this phenomenon very well. Now, of course, I don't know if there's a difference in Portuguese, so I may be on shaky ground here, but Tiago will help me out. There's a difference in meaning between the sentence, the kids played on the bus, and the kids played in the bus. In particular, the sentence, the kids played on the bus, evokes a situation of a bus in service. That is, you go to the bus stop, the bus comes along, you get on the bus, you pay your money, you sit down, and the bus is going along. There happen to be children playing on the bus. That's the situation in which a speaker of English can use the kids played on the bus. The second sentence, the kids played in the bus, can be used in a situation where the bus is not in service. There's a big lot of unused buses. Maybe they need to be repaired, or maybe there's no need for using them at that time, and children are playing in that bus. So having characterized those different situations and having indicated that the difference comes about depending on which tiny word, on or in, you use, you can see, I believe, how the meaning of a single tiny text makes a difference in the meaning of the longer text.
Well, actually, we don't have that. So what we do have, although, is that if one said something like the kids are playing in the middle of the bus, so as crianças estão brincando no meio do ônibus, we would have some kind of inference that the bus was on service.
In service.
In service, okay. And when you say just the kids played in the bus or no ônibus, okay, you wouldn't necessarily have this inference.
Okay, so there are two different words used for the different scenes, but they're not the same different words as in English.
Yeah, I'm quite not sure if this inference is mine, you know, or if people share with me this idea that as crianças estão brincando no meio do ônibus ou estavam brincando no meio do ônibus, parece que o ônibus estava em movimento, enquanto que as crianças estavam brincando no ônibus, não necessariamente se tem essa ideia.
So the question that Tiago was asking, because I understand Portuguese now, is do those two sentences have different meanings?
Não sei, para mim, o sentimento é que há uma interpretação, independentemente de movimento, se o ônibus está lá parado, se é um ônibus numa excursão, né? Se é um ônibus em movimento ou parado. Acho que colocar no meio, acho que não interfere. Não sei o sentimento das pessoas aqui.
There is another example I like to use with my students, which might be more clearer on that. When clearer, in fact, more clear,
More clear?
more clear, yeah.
Or clearer?
Both of them, really?
One or the other,
Okay.
not both.
So in Brazil, when we are talking about the breaks that students may take during their instruction hours, if you use the word recreio, it means that your students are children.
Children?
Yeah, because no one here has recreio.
Okay.
Okay, people here have intervalo. Okay, it's two different words. So if you say my students went to recreio, it means that I have 10-year-olds, 9-year-olds.
Okay, so the different words frame the scene differently.
Yeah.
One word frames the scene as school children, and one word, and the other word frames the scene as university students.
Correct.
Right.
And if you're dealing with teenagers and you tell them that they can go to recreio, they're going to be mad.
Okay.
You know?
Okay, because you're insulting them by calling them 10-year-olds.
Yeah.
Got it. Good. Okay.
And Luciana is telling us that she made this mistake in her first group.
Okay, I'm not going to make that mistake because I don't know either word. Okay, so now I want to ask, does anybody have any questions about the material that I presented? And in order to encourage you to speak up, even if you choose to speak in Portuguese, I want to tell you an anecdote that I think should dispel any concern you might have about being wrong or making a mistake or perhaps feeling embarrassed or stupid or whatever. So years ago, when I was writing my PhD dissertation, I of course had a regular meeting with Chuck Fillmore. I think we met every other week for 2 or 3 hours. In the interim weeks, I was, of course, supposed to be writing. Sometimes I was, sometimes I wasn't. For a long time, I was talking about a particular name for a part of the body in Hebrew, which I wrote about. And I talked about this term as being polysemous. And every time we got back to a conversation about this word, he would wonder whether I understood what polysemy was. As you might imagine, this was pretty worrisome to me because polysemy is absolutely fundamental to semantic analysis. If I didn't understand what polysemy was, then maybe I shouldn't be trying to write a dissertation in lexical semantics. Anyway, we had this argument, so-called argument, over a number of years. It started to become embarrassing to me because he was the professor and I was the student, and uh-oh. So I remember talking to a friend at the time, and I said, I don't understand. We keep arguing about this, Chuck and I. What am I going to do? So we started talking about the data that was involved, and I told her, she asked me a couple of questions and I answered them, and she said, Miriam, you just need to go to Chuck and tell him about that data. So I said, oh, okay. So I went to his office hours. It was an off week, not a week that I was going to have a 2 or 3 hour meeting with him. And I sat down and I said, okay, I want to tell you about some data. And I told him about the data. And he looked at me and he said, oh, sorry, I guess I've been wrong all these years. So I tell you that anecdote so that you know I made a mistake for all those years by not telling him about this data in the way that I needed to tell him about it. And he made a mistake in thinking or believing that I didn't know what polygamy was. All of which is to say, it's okay to make a mistake. The idea is to participate, to engage, to get involved in the conversation, to talk about it, to articulate it, and that's the best way to understand it. Okay? So, yeah, I think we have enough time to think about the following assignment. I would ask you to break up maybe in groups of 5. 5 people in a group, everyone take a place in the room and come up with an example of a script, not the restaurant script, because we talked about that, but something else that you can characterize in the way that I talked about the restaurant script, and think about whether or not there is unique lexical material for that script, or whether the words and phrases and expressions used in that situation can be used more generally in the language. Okay? So now's your opportunity to meet with your fellow classmates, talk about it, let's say maybe 10, 15 minutes. Thiago and I will come around and see how people are doing, give you feedback, and then we'll come together again as a group.